It has become something of a dogma among many contemporary Christian epistemologists that God's beliefs are justified in an epistemically circular way. For example, Elizabeth Jackson has gone on record to say,
So this is a point that Plantinga makes. God actually has to use God's own mind in order to believe I'm omniscient or I am maximally reliable or whatever. So epistemic circularity actually even infects God. I don't think the fact that God has an infinite number of beliefs can help with this, because God is still using God's own mind to think through these beliefs, right? So God uses epistemically circular processes, right?
likewise, Andrew Moon states,
Second point. This point is a point from Alvin Plantinga. Plantinga points out that not even God can know that his own faculties or his mind is reliable without using his own mind. So even God has to use his own mind to come to believe that he himself is reliable and omniscient and so forth. And if it's good enough for God, it's good enough for us.
These claims, which are almost invariably addressed to a predominantly Christian audience, would appear to be an attempt to convince the theist who is hesitant about embracing epistemic circularity that epistemic circularity is acceptable. In other words, this seems to be an argument for the acceptability of epistemic circularity on the assumption that God exists. While atheist and agnostic epistemologists are not likely to find this argument persuasive, since I am a Christian, and since I adamantly oppose the adoption of epistemic circularity, I believe that it is worth my time to assess its merits. Frankly, such bold and unsupported statements from Jackson and Moon leave one wondering how they have come to know that God himself is consigned to epistemic circularity. Are the arguments for this conclusion airtight and unassailable? One cannot ascertain this from Jackson or Moon because, in fact, they offer no justification whatsoever for thinking that God cannot escape epistemic circularity. Both of them observe that they have taken this idea from Alvin Plantinga. Hopefully Jackson and Moon do not simply believe this claim for the sole reason that Alvin Plantinga says so. But has Plantinga supported this claim? Here is the relevant passage from Warranted Christian Belief. Not even God himself, necessarily omniscient as he is, can give a non-circular argument for the reliability of his ways of forming beliefs. God himself is trapped inside the circle of his own ideas. If, per impossible, he became a bit apprehensive about the reliability of those ways of forming beliefs, he would be in the same epistemic boat as we are about that question. He couldn't give an epistemically non-circular argument for the reliability of his ways of forming beliefs, for the beliefs constituting the premises of any such argument would themselves have been formed in those ways, but any epistemic debility that afflicts a necessarily omniscient being is hardly worth worrying about. Plantinga's only justification for this conclusion, as far as I can see, comes from his designation of God's ideas as being in the shape of a circle. How this vague claim is supposed to justify the conclusion that God's beliefs are justified in an epistemically circular way, I can only speculate. As best I can tell, the argument runs something like this. 1. If one cannot get outside of their own ideas, then they cannot justify these ideas without engaging in epistemic circularity. 2. God cannot get outside of his own ideas. 3. Therefore, God cannot justify his ideas without engaging in epistemic circularity. This argument is formally valid, however there is good reason to think that it is not sound. In the first place, it is less than clear what Plantinga means by being trapped inside one's own ideas. Perhaps this means that one cannot have access to an idea which is not their own idea. In a trivial sense, I suppose that this is true. Under this interpretation, therefore, the second premise of the argument is true. It is less clear why one should accept the first premise. I suppose that Plantinga means that one has to appeal to their own ideas, by which I understand him to mean beliefs, to justify their other ideas. This comports well with Plantinga's claims elsewhere that non-propositional content cannot justify beliefs. In his own words, it is simply not the right kind of animal to be a reason, since it is not itself a belief. But for those of us who do believe that non-propositional content can justify beliefs, there appears to be no reason to think that premise 1 is true. Indeed, Plantinga's argument establishes little more than that if someone thinks that only beliefs can justify beliefs, then they are committed to approving of epistemic circularity. But this has never been particularly controversial, and it makes one wonder why Plantinga brought God into the conversation at all. If Plantinga's argument for God's beliefs being justified in an epistemically circular way depends, at bottom, upon the assumption that only beliefs can justify beliefs, then he has utterly failed to give the traditional foundationalist any reason to accept that God's beliefs are justified in an epistemically circular way. This is because the debates between traditional foundationalists and their critics have usually focused upon this exact point of contention. Because Plantinga's argument seems to simply assume something which the traditional foundationalist disputes, it cannot function as an independent reason for the traditional foundationalist to approve of epistemic circularity. Consequently, not only does Plantinga's argument fail to establish its conclusion, but his introducing God into the picture appears to be superfluous and plausibly counterproductive. As Timothy and Lydia McGrew observe, the argument here can, with more justice, be inverted. A theory according to which an omniscient being cannot satisfactorily answer even his own skeptical questions about the epistemic status of his beliefs is highly suspect on its face. Since the conclusion of the argument cannot be demonstrated from a premise which is acceptable to the skeptic of epistemic circularity, it is question-begging, and, therefore, proponents of epistemic circularity will have to look elsewhere to justify the idea that epistemic circularity is ever permissible.